can actually extinguish itself. It's not just the gas that explodes. We also look for another gas called choke damp underground. Right, that is heavier than air. It's carbon dioxide and nitrogen, so it sinks to the floor, displaces oxygen, chokes you to death. The lamp will not burn without oxygen, so we put a large flame on. We know it sinks to the floor, so we'll walk into roadways holding the lamp like that at knee level. If it goes out, we know there's no oxygen. We turn round and come back. Simple as that.
The disaster at Pretoria was caused initially by a fire damp explosion. This would not normally in itself have led to such a massive loss of life, had it not also ignited coal dust, causing this to explode in a chain reaction throughout the workings.
Fire damp explosions are usually often limited, as accumulations of explosive mixtures are relatively small volumes compared to the total volume of air circulating in mines. The first essential for the prevention of accumulations of fire damp is an adequate quantity of air and a well-arranged ventilation system.
Nowadays, we'll look for it with these, called a methanometer. We can tell to small percentages exactly the amount of gas there is. We would hold it up to the roof like this and measure for percentages of gas. We also still use those. These are very, very reliable, a Davy lamp. Still got to use them by law, and most coal miners will tell you it's a miner's best friend. Find that gas, which we know floats to the roof, we put a very small flame on, called a testing flame, like that. We turn cap lamps off, we hold it to the roof like that. If there is any gas present, we'll measure. We can tell by the shape of the flame and the colour of it, the height of it, how much gas is there. This is still super reliable after 200 years.
Other important factors include the prohibition of open lights or naked lights and the proper installation and maintenance of electrical equipment. The working rule at the Pretoria pit was a half-inch cap or flame at the coal face, indicating between 2 and 3% gas, sufficient to fence off, meaning that no one was permitted to work there. The fireman is a mining official responsible for testing for gas in the workings and reporting his findings in a log. It was a common practice at the Pretoria for firemen to report giving off gas diluted as made. This meant, of course, that no gas could be detected a short distance away from the coal face.
There were rumours that Pretoria was a gassy mine. There is evidence of men being sent home because of the presence of gas.
There are numerous accounts of gas being encountered at the Pretoria pit, and it was apparently common knowledge in the area. The wife of one miner, Albert Lonsdale, said that her husband had complained of gas often. The son of another miner, Matthew Seddon, said his father had worked at the mine for 4 years. On several occasions had to run to the shaft bottom out of the mine workings, due to gas coming off the face and putting the safety lamps out. Other miners complained of the atmosphere in the mine being very hot. Again, the father of a young miner, James MacDonald, said his son returned home 3 mornings out of 6 on account of there being gas present in the workings. In fact, 2 days before the explosion, on the 18th of December, 2% fire damp was present near the roof and against the coal face in a recess at the furthest end of number 1 jig in the North Plodder district.
George Ratcliffe, in charge of the mechanical coal cutter, is the last man to leave the yard level at around 6:40 a.m. on the morning of 21st December. All seemed in order. 6:45 a.m. The day shift descended to bring up the coal that had been mined during the previous night. 7:50 a.m. The ground shook for miles around when the Pretoria pit exploded. Richard, a youngster in central Atherton, about a mile from the mine, heard the explosion. He didn't realise its significance until later that day. Ernest Corner, a boy of 10 at the time, was woken at 7:50 by a sudden thump and the bed shaking. His father had just returned home from the night shift at the Checkerbent pit and said to him, "That's Pretoria gone up." The mine manager, Alfred Tong, who was having breakfast, heard the report at 7:50 a.m. and headed towards the mine.
The explosion had occurred at 7:50 a.m. It was now 8:10. To illustrate the strength of that explosion, I would talk about the man who farmed, a local farmer who farmed the home farm on the Hulton estate, a man called Richard Jackson, or Dick Jackson. And he spoke to me, he was an old man when he told me, that he had gone out early morning to do some winter ploughing. He had with him a 2 steel and iron plough and a bucket seat, metal bucket seat on the back, 2 Shire horses, and he was just beginning to plough when the man went up. He was working in a field some 250, 300 yards from the actual pit itself. The explosion lifted him, the plough and the Shire horses off the floor 2 or 3 foot and dropped them back down again. Other farmers in the area told that the hawthorn hedges, which are common in this part of the world, which divided the fields, were pulled flat to the ground, so there's a massive implosion as well as a number of explosions. After 24 hours, these bushes righted themselves and came up right again. So the effect, if you feel the sense of the bang and the explosion that it had, massive. My mother at 8.5 years told me that she lived in Mabel Street, which was about 1.5 miles down the line, just near Daisy Hill Station, adjacent to Daisy Hill Station, when the explosion occurred. It knocked her on her backside on the floor, and she ran into the house to my grandmother, who took her to the window, and out through the window to see all the neighbours running up the road, running down to the railway station to get up the line to get to the pit, because they knew what had happened. The whistles were blowing and the ladies were there, in many of them in their night dresses with coats clothing over them, and they just made for the pit as fast as they could.
The explosion happened on the 21st of December 1910 at approximately 7:52 a.m. and we know this from the discovery of a pocket watch on the body of one of the miners. The glass in the case had been broken and scorched, and the fingers had stopped at exactly 7:52 a.m. And this watch can be seen on display in West Orton Library in what is known as the Pretoria Collection.
The engine tenter entered Greensmith's weaving shed at 8 a.m. Something he seldom did. The weavers' faces went white. One woman fainted, then another. The gates to the factory were locked until dinner time, so the weaver spent a nervous morning speculating on what could have happened. 8:10 a.m. Alfred Tong arrived at the pit. Smoke was coming out of number 3 shaft. The casing had been partially wrecked by the explosion, making it impossible to descend in the cage. He went to number 4 shaft.
This had been damaged to a lesser extent. Signal wires and cage bearers were broken, and one of the cages was stuck. Another cage appeared to be free, and Alfred Tong and some of the other men started to free it.
8:40 a.m. Sergeant Major Hill, in charge of the nearby Howe Bridge Rescue Station, arrived at the mine with emergency apparatus. 9 a.m. Alfred Tong took 8 men with him and descended in silence in the number 4 shaft cage.
There was a number of people who went down in it, and we have the list of people here who were in the first cage that went down. The first person in the cage was, of course, the general manager, Mr. Alfred Tong. And then there was an electrical fireman by the name of Henry Polly. James Moss, a shaftsman, and John Hilton, shaftsmen, they too were in. William Martland, a fireman, and John Hardman, a fireman from one of the other pits. Both of these men went down. Robert Roberts was a fireman. John Herring and James Hartley too were firemen.
On the way down, the cage continually got stuck on various obstacles, and they wondered whether the cage would make it.
By 9:05 in the morning, the cage reached the Trencherbourne mine, where Llewellyn Williams, the under-manager, was at the mouthing. Alfred asked if all the men were safe, and he said yes, but some were suffering slightly from fumes.
Richard, the youngster in Atherton, met a man named Billy Davis, who told him the pit had exploded. Richard asked which one. The yard mine was the answer. Richard went straight home to tell his mother, and then immediately to the pit. His father, brother Lewis, and uncles Stanley and Jim were all down the pit that day.
Llewellyn got into the cage and travelled down with Alfred. The cage reached the yard mouthing, where considerable wreckage from the explosion was evident. The underground fan had been blown inwards towards the number 4 shaft, indicating that the explosive force had gone from west to east. The atmosphere was very hot, with a presence of afterdamp. The only ventilating fan in operation was the one in the Trencherbourne mine. The men found dead bodies everywhere. One survivor, named Byers, was found and carried to the cage. He was severely burned all over his body. Although he made it to the surface, sadly, he died the following day.
10:30 a.m. A youth called Gibson was brought to the surface.
He was found entirely naked, badly burned all over and covered in a thick layer of coal dust. He lived only a short time before dying from shock.
11 a.m. A crowd started to gather at the pithead, waiting for news of their menfolk.
A contingent of the Bolton Borough Police were in attendance to maintain some form of order. The crowd grew as the day wore on. Men were frantically working to repair the fan at the surface to resume ventilation.
Meanwhile, below ground, the cage slowly descended to a lower yard mouthing, where they found a lad called Staveley.
Joseph Staveley, aged 16, son of James, head surface manager, is a handsome grey-eyed lad. His duties required him regularly to go down the pit, and he was well acquainted with the roads. Then came the explosion. A great gust of wind brushed him and his companions about. Next came a deafening report. He has an impression of soft bodies striking him, of something heavy which hurtled past by in the darkness, and of the immense force which wrapped itself around him and swept him off his feet. The shaft was in complete darkness.
On the surface, 40 men had arrived from local mines to help with the rescue operation. It was arranged that special squads would not be underground longer than 2 hours, and every team carried a canary in a cage as an advance warning of gas. In fact, canaries were bred for this specific purpose and kept in mine rescue headquarters. A temporary hospital was set up in the miners' union room under the control of Dr. Mallet from Bolton Infirmary. Meanwhile, the cage had arrived at the Arley seam at the very bottom of the shaft. When Alfred and the others arrived there, it was obvious that there was a panic situation, with men crying to be taken to the surface. Alfred maintained order and insisted that most ill men should be placed in the cage first, and then they would return for the rest. The men responded to this plea, and Alfred started to get the men out of the mine.
Miners nearest the explosion died instantly. Its power blew some literally to pieces. One man was found impaled almost the whole length of his body on a piece of timber.
James Holt was literally lifted off his feet and carried 12 to 14 yards. A boy called Roberts, who was near the pit eye, which is the pit eye, bottom of the pit, was knocked over on his face and had his leg broken. George Byers heard the explosion like a great bump. He and 4 others made for the pit eye, their first instinct being to get to the shaft where they could be rescued. He stumbled and fell and remembered nothing. He'd been found by his brother James Byers, a member of a rescue party, who had carried and dragged him some 400 yards to safety.
12 o'clock. All 545 men in the Trenchybone and Arley mines had been raised to the surface. The ill were treated in the makeshift hospital. Most suffered from fumes. 4 local doctors were in attendance: Blakemore, Russell, Lee and Rackler. The injured were taken by special train to Bolton and then to Bolton Royal Infirmary. 12:20 p.m. A fire was found at an air crossing on the east level. Some men were left to put it out, and Alfred continued through the workings to see if he could find any more fires. Mr. Gerard, HM Inspector of Mines, had arrived along with other mining engineers. Meanwhile, the men were still engaged in putting out the fires in the east level and the Downbrow district. Massive roof falls were found, some 200 yards long, involving tons of material. The rescue teams were still hopeful of finding other men alive. A man called Davenport was found. He was given a drink and sent to the surface. He was found near a manhole, where there was sufficient air to keep him alive. 1 p.m. The crowds were gathering during the day. Some women were angry because they said their men had told them that it was a gassy mine, and they were afraid of something like this happening. The joiner's shop at the mine was converted into a makeshift mortuary for purposes of identification. During the afternoon, rescuers worked continually in shifts to search for survivors and to resume circulating air throughout the workings.
The rescue squads were supplied with the first ever breathing apparatus, the Proto.
The thing that came to light is that about the mines rescue unit at Howbridge was that